He waddles away.
I'm sorry I've started today's videotape late. So, assignment 10.1, number 1, many ways that healthy ecosystems benefit us. They recover more quickly from the things that we harvest. They clean air and water. There's a couple things now that we're missing in your book. I think everything I've said so far was in there, but there's a few things I'd like to add. Some ecosystems are a really good place to sink carbon. Forest, grassland, swamp, wetland. The really productive ones are a good place to sink carbon. That gives humans a huge benefit because otherwise we don't really seem to have a way to get rid of carbon these days. We've built an economy that makes all this extra carbon, so where we're going to put it, grassland, forest, swamp, wetland, good place to put carbon. Another thing that your book did not mention is at the bottom here, economic participation. If air is clean, you can work more and your economy is bigger. I can't remember the exact number, so you should Google this yourselves. But somewhere around 1 to 2% of the Chinese economy is lost to people staying home due to air pollution in the big cities of China, Shanghai and Beijing. Think about that. If somebody could promise you 1 or 2% economic growth, that's like halfway to breaking records. Because you realize, like, if you stayed home, you didn't go to the factory to, assemble a shoe or cure cancer at the research hospital or whatever. Every day that air quality affects human health, that lowers our participation in the economy. Also, air pollution costs us in healthcare costs. And healthcare costs takes money away from other stuff. I couldn't buy the nice fishing reel because I'm still paying for my kid's asthma medicine. And so healthcare expenses drain other spending that might be more profitable in our economy. This is what we mean by economic participation. Something that I read recently that I think applies here, you realize that if water is dirty, that's not a place where people want to live. Like, imagine trying to sell a house right now in Flint, Michigan, where the water coming out of the tap has been deemed unsafe for humans for many years. That's not just a first world problem with tap water. Like, nobody wants to build a factory on a river that has corpses coming down it. And so whether you're talking about river quality or soil toxicity or tap water quality, economic activity likes a clean environment. And so we have more economic participation, more people making more money in clean environments. There's something else that I want to talk to you about, but I need somebody to get on my Apple TV. Who's on the school Wi-Fi? You on the school Wi-Fi? Do you have an Apple phone? Yeah. Okay, turn on your device.
I'd be too scared to do.
Google, make sure there's nothing on your phone that you'd be embarrassed to show the students by accident. And then do a Google image search for yellow boxfish. Once you have that image, I'd like you to, you know how to use Apple TV?
I know.
Yellow boxfish?
Yellow boxfish. Boxfish is one word.
Is that the fish that was like made after, or like they made a color after it?
We're gonna try to get a picture. Angel, do you know how to use the Apple TV? 65?
Oh, wait.
Chase, don't mess up the recording. It's bad enough they gotta look at me.
Their sound quality is just like shit because Chase is just talking.
Oh. Oh yeah,
8087.
yeah.
So smart. That's our president right there, baby.
Genius.
Okay, slide the image over to the right a little bit. The image search, or you can go to images maybe. And keep moving, keep moving. Keep
They're so
moving.
cute.
Keep go. There's a specific image that I'm looking for. Oh, well, go down. Okay, there we go. Stay there for a second. Children, this is a yellow. Can you turn your phone sideways, please?
Just click on the
Just turn the phone sideways. Oh, yeah.
Jose, you're good at
Yeah,
this.
it's off. Well, no, if you turn it sideways, it turns on its own thing.
I know, silly.
There we go.
Oh, it's like giving you a
Swipe.
kiss.
Okay, swipe.
Looks sad.
Where are the related
The other
searches? Do you have to go up for the related searches?
My God.
It's okay.
He's so smart.
We'll get there. Keep going.
I know it for sure.
Yeah, you do it.
Your phone has to be vertical to see the related
Miller,
searches.
I think you can do it, bro.
Okay, right there. Can we get that boxfish card?
Miller!
Look, see?
They're all saltwater.
Boxfish collar.
He's got it.
It's right there. Miller here.
Click on that image. Boxfish card. Click on the first one.
Wait, why don't you just search boxer scar?
I couldn't
Ew,
remember how to
holy
find
shit.
it. Now turn it sideways, please.
And it's a Mercedes too? Good God. Play. My new car record is
Okay. A, I've learned my lesson. We'll never do that again. B, some science dork was trying to figure out why this fish looks so weird. You have to admit it's a weird looking fish. Some like vertebrate morphologist was studying why this shape would have evolved. It's very costly. They have a whole lot of skeletal investment. They don't have like major predators, and so it's not a defensive skeleton. Like, why would a fish invest all of this calcium carbonate? They're very slow growing, so it's difficult for a fish to survive because they grow slowly. So why would you grow in this weird shape? And they figured out that there's a whole lot of turbulence on coral reefs because the structure of the reef is really complex, and the forces of the moving water are really dynamic. You get all these compression and sideways and fluxes. And this poor little fish hovers to eat. They eat in place. So they eat the stuff coming off of polyps. Like when a polyp tries to breed, or when a polyp poops or releases leftover food or whatever. And so the boxfish. And so the fish is trying to stay put.
She's asking what a polyp is.
Polyp is a type of invertebrate. Turns out that a shape that's really useful in a turbulent environment is actually a really good idea for a small car on high-speed freeways like the Autobahn. And so Mercedes was able to develop this ugly-looking car based on the same shape elements, the same hydrodynamics of the fish applied to the aerodynamics of the car. It's not sold in the US, but this was a really big deal in Europe because the car had like exceptional handling and crosswinds and at high speed. Apparently improved safety while traveling at higher speed, which is a big deal for some customers in European markets.
It's like, when you're going 140 miles an hour.
Right. This is one example of a thing called biomimicry. Angel, maybe if you had 45 minutes with an audience, you could look for humpback whale fin.
Oh yeah, they did
Car.
think about this at the
They have a
Maritime
whole range
Museum.
of
They
different
talked about all of this when I
Yeah,
was a little kid.
Miller, what's the other thing that they did?
So they found out, they were wondering why a humpback whale's like fin has like the jaggedness of it, and they found out that like it helps it like go through the water like a lot easier. So then they mimicked that into windmills, and they made the windmills the same like type of shape as a humpback whale's fin, and it increased by like a drastic amount. It was
And
ridiculous.
so, here's one thing about healthy ecosystems. We can learn how to make better industrial designs inspired by nature. You see, we mimic what life does. People have now synthesized spider web, and so people make suspension bridges where you can't see the suspension cables.
So weird.
I mean, sorry. We will be able to make
Yeah, that's
suspension
what I
bridges.
thought.
So we haven't scaled it up to that volume. Like there isn't a suspension bridge I can show you. But we can now make synthetic spider web.
Don't they use like goat milk
Yeah,
to
they
produce
use-
the enzymes?
As a matter of fact, I wouldn't have remembered unless you said it, but that does sound familiar, yes.
Yeah, they do.
And it was like, yeah, I'm Spider-Man.
They made a paint that looks different color from different angles so that your house looks green from the street, but from the sky it looks white. So it's like, doesn't gain as much heat but still has colors. That was inspired by mimicking the scales of geckos.
Yes.
Well, the point is that if the boxfish had gone extinct or the whale had not remained in the ocean until recently, or the gecko had not been available for study, we wouldn't have these products that do have a market. I don't know who cares about two-color houses, but apparently people do. And so this is another way that healthy ecosystems have a value to humans. Finally, there's one that doesn't sound terribly valuable to you, but there's a lot of things in nature that we don't know yet that might be useful. This is the prospect value of diversity. Like maybe down the road we could make a food out of this, or maybe down the road we could cure a disease with this. You know, given that we're losing a few species a year, what if one of them had an enzyme that would help us cure cancer and we let it go extinct without checking first? You know, if you have a huge collection of diversity around the planet, some of those might be useful tools that we haven't tried yet. I don't know if you've noticed, but every couple of years people are like, oh my god, acai is so good for you, or chai seeds are, what are they called? Chia seeds. Chia seeds are so good for you, or whatever, some wonder food of the year. You know, there's a lot of stuff that we just haven't gotten around to eating yet. Like, might be good to eat. So, biomimicry, industrial products that mimic nature. Prospect value is stuff that might be useful later. And economic participation is healthy people in a healthy environment make more money. Coffin, can you put your phone away, please? Yeah. I'm done with number one unless somebody wanted to ask me something. Yes?
How is future value calculated?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a really tricky thing. We all know that a whole ecosystem is good for us, but trying to describe the price of a single thing is really tough. Especially if it's not worth something now, it's tough to figure out how much it's going to be worth down the road when it's more rare. The answer is there's really no clear, simple solution. So like, you know, we know that whales are important for the ocean to work well, but we don't really understand exactly how important they are. And like, how do I value a whale? Like if you're gonna give me $80 for all the whale blubber, like what do I compare that to? Like as an investor, if I'm in charge of the whales, I can get $80 now, or how much is that worth next year, next 100 years, and 1,000 years? Like if I was holding onto rare baseball cards or something, I could at least do some kind of an equation about your offer versus the future value of that baseball card. But for single parts of nature, you really can't calculate that. And so what we end up doing is we just get whatever we can get for them now. And so back in the day, people would have only given you $1 for that whale blubber, and that was still worth it. Like, you never know what it's going to be worth in the future, so people just take whatever they get for it. We never know how to value nature. It never has a way to prospect its cost. Yeah?
Can you run through like an abbreviated version of the relationship between indirect, direct, external, and
I
internal?
plan to for study goal number 2. Let's go to study goal number 2. How are you completing your homework from your phone screen? How are you completing your homework from your phone screen? Could you stop? So we've talked about direct and indirect, external and internal costs once or twice before. This is, first of all, important for the AP test. That's why I bring it up again in Unit 10. Second of all, I think this is really important for any life you want to have in economics or policy. Third of all, I think it's just a really mature and thoughtful way to make environmental decisions. So it's kind of like bro advice from a grown-up. It's kind of in many careers useful, and it's important in 2 weeks for the test. One of the most critical things about economics is we assume that people behave rationally. And whether that's true or not, that's at the heart of economics. When I go buy my bottle of Tapatio, but it's like $1.29, $2, whatever. Let's call it $2. I'm like, yeah, okay, $2 is a good value because Senor Tapatio had to buy a bunch of chili peppers and garlic and vinegar and seasonings, and had to operate a factory where they grind all that up. And he had to buy some glass and some plastic and some paper, and he's included all of those costs in the bottle that he sold to Senor Albertson. So when I walk into Albertson's, Mr. Albertson gets a cut. The rest goes to Senor Tapatio, who gets a cut. The rest goes to the people who make the chili peppers and the vinegar and the salt. And I'm like, yeah, for $2, that's a good deal. I'm comfortable paying for that. So I make a rational decision that this is going to give me a good value for my $2, and I bought it. I don't think this is my student, nor this one, nor this one. This is room 65. All right. For $2, a bottle of Tapatio, I'm gonna get a lot of seasoning for my $2. That's a good deal. So I made my decision based on those prices that were included in the $2. Those are the internal prices. That's the internalized costs. Because Senor Tapatio pays them directly, or because Mr. Albertson pays Senor Tapatio, when I go pay them, we say that the direct cost of production plus the direct cost of retail are captured, they are internal, to the $2 price. And then I get to make my decision as a customer. If you don't like this, you don't buy it for $2. If I like it, I buy it for $2. We both decide it. Okay, we all understand what the $2 means? The internal and direct. It's like what was part of the transaction, that's somebody's budget. Now I'll tell you a story which is inspired by a real story. It's not the Tapatio story, it's the Sriracha story. But anyway, imagine, for the sake of conversation, The Senor Tapatio's factory, in grinding up all of those peppers, their exhaust fans blow like a toxic cloud of capsaicin dust into some neighborhood in Inglewood or Long Beach or something. And people in that whole neighborhood come down with like respiratory drama and like runny eyes, and they have to take time off work, and they have to go to the hospital and pay medical fees. That's all tied to the Tapatio factory. That is a real cost. I need your notes to include that word somewhere, that it's a real cost. It has dollar values. Like that factory cost $7,000 in lost wages because 100 people couldn't make 70 bucks a day or whatever. And that factory cost, I don't know, 100 grand in medical bills because one person had to have a visit. Now those real costs are tied to the Tapatio sauce. They're real, but they're not direct to Senor Tapatio. He didn't pay those lost wages back. He didn't cover those hospital bills. So he didn't include them in the price. What? Mr. Albertson didn't pay the medical bills or the lost wages, so they're not included in his price. We say that the Tapatio factory's lost wages and hospital bills in their community, those are external to the $2 fee. They're indirect. I didn't pay, Albertson didn't pay, Mr. Tapatio didn't pay, some other person had to pay them. We call those indirect or external costs. Because they're real, it's a dollar total, it's real money, but they're not part of the supply chain for the Tapatio, they're part of what you get for living around the Tapatio factory. It just sucks to live near the Tapatio factory. Sorry, homie, you gotta pay for that. That's your problem, because you live there. Everything I've said so far is just the vocab. I wanna make sure we got the words straight. Then we're gonna talk about why this matters to you. The College Board needs you to know those words. Does anybody wanna ask me about those words? Direct, indirect, internal, external.
You said you use external and indirect in the same kind of thing.
That's right.
Is there a difference?
Direct costs are internal to the price. So somebody in that supply chain had to pay them directly, so they're included in the price within that supply chain.
So internal and external are just they're talking about if it's whether or not it's in the transaction, and then indirect and direct, or whether or not it's in the price.
Actually, vice versa, but yes, they're both the same concept. You've made the right distinction. You're just putting the word in the wrong place. I can give you more examples if that helps you. We would say that chili peppers are a direct expense to Senor Tapatio.
Okay.
Or electrical bills are a direct expense to Mr. Albertson's store.
Because he needs both those to make his product.
Right? And so when they decide how much to charge at wholesale or at retail for the Tapatio sauce, they will internalize electrical costs into their price. Because they had to pay those expenses, they're going to pass that on to the consumer so that they can recover all of their costs.
Right.
So the direct costs are internalized. Indirect is something where another person has to pay, but it's not someone in the supply chain of the Tapatio Albertsons example.
But what they're paying for is part of making the product.
That's right. It's an associated cost that's outside the budget of the parties so far. So you're right that lost wages and medical care are tied to the Tapatio factory. That's real. They're real costs that are associated with the transaction. But since Senor Tapatio and Senor Albertson never had to pay for those things. They're indirect. So it's associated, but it's on someone else's budget. Because it's on someone else's budget, they don't have to pay for that, so they don't include that in the $2 that I paid them.
So let's say CTO
Yeah.
invests in a way that like he invests his own money
Yeah.
into controlling.
Now that internalizes the cost.
That internalizes and that
Then I'm going to start paying $3 so that he could buy some air quality controls. And I might not think it's worth $3, so he's going to lose some wages.
So he internalizes it because he's made it a direct cost.
So now comes the strategy stuff. You're right. You're right. When he makes it a direct cost, he will internalize it. You're right about that. Chase, can you put your phone away?
Oh, what do I do? This one's fine.
Oh, even better. Here we go. The reason this matters about direct and indirect, we all love stuff that's cheap or that feels cheap. Nobody likes to pay all the costs. If I had to pay $18 for my Tapatio so that the dude could make clean air and pay everybody back for all their lost wages, I'd probably not buy this and he'd be out of business. If somebody can get the chili peppers for free through some kind of heinous activity where they remove direct cost, they can make a cheaper sauce. I'll buy the cheaper one because I'm a rational consumer. I want the same chili sauce for less dollars. You would do the same thing. So, externalities are bad for the economy. Excuse me. They're good for the economy, but they're bad for the environment. You guys want like the ultimate, most famous example, and then we'll move on?
Yes.
Here's the ultimate, most famous example. Here's the most famous example. Our current global economy would collapse if we internalized all the costs of the fossil fuels economy. Imagine how much you'd pay for gasoline if that cost included air pollution controls, dealing with climate change, cleaning up ocean pollution, the impact on global fisheries from oil spills. Imagine if all of that was in the price when you went to the pump. If you show up tomorrow at the 76 station and they're like $37 a gallon, and you're like, what? It was like $3.19 yesterday. And they're like, yes, but now we've internalized all the externalities of gasoline. So you're paying for the lost productivity of the kids in Texas who live right next to the refinery. You're paying for the life insurance policy for the person who got in an accident when the tanker rolled over in the 76 supply chain. If you take all the impacts of the petroleum world and you include them in the price, it goes so high that nobody wants to do it. We would stop buying fossil fuels. Fossil fuels look really cheap. Because you know what? All the real costs of the fossil fuel economies are external to the future.
So it's just a tragedy of economics.
Yeah, like I get my gasoline for cheap because you're going to deal with the cost of climate change.
Right.
Like your economy will have to hustle. Like if you're living in Santa Barbara, you're going to be pulling back the wastewater treatment facility and the Amtrak station and the middle school and all that stuff, and the junior high school, I mean. That's going to be your local economy impact. By the time you have to do all that, I'm going to be in the ground. I love this deal. It's like I just bought a BMW on your credit card.
So industries benefit more from externalizing costs.
Please.
Say what now?
So industries benefit more from
Yeah. I mean, people get rich on finding someone else to pay their costs. You know, it's like the concept of getting stuff for free when someone else has to pay for it. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Tin Stoffel, like someone else had to cover that. People often say this about social welfare, and in other parts of the world, people say this about corporate welfare. It's like we're using our money to support someone. Right now, we're using our money to support parts of the economy because the cost is gonna come from you eventually, just not quite yet. Like, my dad's generation, their whole economic growth was built on externalizing climate change costs. Like, if they had to pay for the cost of climate change, the economy would be flat or negative in his whole lifetime.
So it's like kind of like putting aside, like ignoring like problems in order to benefit in the present.
Externalizing them, making them someone else's problem. We're making climate change the future's problem.
So in the future, someone's paying the indirect costs of our externalities.
That's right. That's right. Like when I go to the 76 station, they're not giving any money to dealing with rising sea level. The only money that they're charging me for $3.19 a gallon is like drilling and refining and moving. And I'm like, yeah, but isn't this like affecting global biodiversity? They're like, yeah, but we're not paying for that. And I'm like, isn't this like polluting the oceans? And they're like, yeah, we don't have to cover that because those are all external, so it looks cheap. Someone pays. They're real costs, but they're outside of the transaction, so they're not included in the price.
And this is outside of any other value besides money, right?
Right. You know, like every economist agrees that you make better decisions when you're more informed about costs. That like the way to win a strategic game is to have more information. So there's no doubt that we should internalize, but it's also true that for every business, the more you externalize, the more profit you can keep. All right. Now we switch to talking about cities. Number 3, humans used to live in these teeny little itty bitty villages because transportation was difficult. People like the Romans built these empires where now you could move stuff around. This became the suburbs of the 60s and 70s. Oh my God, the suburbs are such a crazy idea. Do you all know that that's a purely American thing?
Yeah.
The suburbs were invented in America, and almost everywhere in the world, cities are built before suburbs were possible. After World War II, America had all this money and all this technology, and everybody was all excited. The economy was growing and growing and growing, and fossil fuels were so cheap. And everybody was like, I don't want to live in the city where the factories are. I want my own little ranch a couple hours away. So people bought these huge houses, and from the 40s to the 70s, housing size more than doubled. Your grandparents lived in a house less than half the size of your house. All those houses had their own little private parks, and so we got into lawns and turf and irrigation and lawnmowers. That's like a totally new American economy. Everybody made their own little pools, so we stopped going to community pools and had our own little private ones. That was new in the suburb days. And when you have this big old house and you're far away from everybody else, you can have your own of stuff that people used to share. So the ability to consume your own personal ladder or your own personal set of tools instead of borrowing from a friend or a lending library or whatever, like American homes are now stocked full of stuff that 2 generations ago, there was just like a set for every group of people. Now, the suburbs turned out to be a really good feeling that became a really bad idea. Fast forward to 2019, people have to drive like 2 hours each way. The roads are impossible to maintain. There's too many cars. The climate change and smog are killing us. We can't afford the gasoline. Our economy is like totally flipping. It's just balanced on this razor's edge of how much a petroleum of gasoline sells for. Sorry, a barrel of gasoline sells for. And so I actually envy your youth because I think you get to reimagine cities, and I think that's kind of the coolest thing in environmental futures, is trying to imagine how cities could be cooler. not temperature, but like environmentally cooler. So let's talk a little bit about cities and then we'll be done. Number 4, 3 vocab terms, that's it. Number 5, there was this guy named Frederick Olmsted. You woke up early today to move those bees.
Yeah.
Do you guys know that Chase had to wake up at 5:10 in the morning? Actually at 5 o'clock so he could move them by 5:10. That's
Congrats,
true.
Chase.
Yesterday.
I'm almost done. This guy Frederick Olmsted said, you know, now that we're starting to build this New York City, I think it was originally called New Amsterdam, is that right? And then the Dutch traded it for a bunch of islands in the South Pacific or something.
Oh,
That was such a bad trade. What a stupid maneuver that was. Back when they were building New York City, this is like when New York was still a colony, not the United States yet. This is like in the mid-1970s. Frederick Olmsted,
the mid-1970s?
1750s, mid-1700s.
So smart. You know, hippies, colonialism. Are you taking a bow after
I
that?
do this, no, I'm just stretching my calves. I do this over and over and over again every day, and the numbers just like jumble through there. Back in the mid-1700s, before we were the United States and New York was still a colony, this dude Frederick Olmsted had a crazy idea. He was hired to do some really early planning of the city, and so people were like, yeah, we'll put the factories, and we'll put the streets, and we'll put the docks, and we'll make bridges. And his idea was, hey, we should save some green space. Now the crazy thing for you to imagine is, all those old white guys that he was talking to, they were all born on a farm. So he says, we should save some green space because birds and butterflies and breezes. And all the other bros were like, nah, dude, people come to the city because factories and business and opportunity. And he's like, but you know, all of like the bird song and like the sunrise and that settling air at sunset. And they're like, no, dude, I'm from the country, the mud stuck to your boots and the swarms of yellow jackets and the sunburn or whatever. And he was like, fine, let's just try one thing. You let me keep a little tiny park in the middle of New York City, and I won't say anything if you put buildings and streets on the entire rest of the city map. And they were like, yeah, got him. Go ahead, Freddie, we can do that. So Frederick Olmsted argued for what has now become Central Park. And I don't know if you know this, but anybody want to take a guess at where in the world the most expensive square foot of real estate is?
New York.
Where in New York?
Central Park.
Overlooking Central Park. Yeah, you can't build in Central Park. Your president, I believe, is the historically largest owner of Central Park property. You might know that the two most valuable pieces on the Monopoly board are and Park Place, which are the two streets that define Central Park, and that's why. Because in the game of real estate, they're the most expensive real estate. And Frederick Olmsted, of course, we now realize was right. We do actually like having access to nature. We want those butterflies.
Cool.
You know this because apparently you live in the United States or California's city with the most green space per person. I believe so, and I'm suspicious of that claim, but I've heard it twice now. You could Google this. I don't know. I'm curious.
Is that like within a limit of people though?
I don't know if it's the county. I don't know if it counts the national forest. I don't know. Maybe it's the county. Maybe it's when we had Goleta, because it's been a while since the last time I heard this. Now that Goleta's a separate city, maybe that's changed. But you know, you live in a pretty green place, and so you know how nice this is. I don't know how many of you have been to like Calcutta, India, but there is not like a patch of green grass in Calcutta. Like the entire effing city, which is a humongous city, is all built out. Globally, cities don't have green space.
We're not even close to being on this
fine.
list. It's like Moscow, Iceland, Singapore.
Are we on that list at all?
Vienna, no.
Maybe we're on the bigger cities? California? I don't know. Somebody told me that.
Silly.
Well, somebody told me with great assurance, so I wonder if they might have had some way that it's right. Whatever the case about Santa Barbara, Fred Olmsted gets credit for the idea that people do better when they're around green stuff. And check this out. Please look up. That photo of my wife with my 2 children, and this photo of one of my children, I'm not sure which one because they look the same. And this photo of my family, one of our annual family portraits that we take in the same place every year. And this high spot over my son's shoulder. And where are we? This family portrait and this family portrait and this family portrait are all taken at Olmsted Peak in Yosemite, which of course is named in commemoration of this guy that had this unique idea. And Yosemite, of course, is like all the national parks about getting people in touch with nature. But I wonder if they gave him the place where you can walk a really short distance to get a really dramatic view. Like I always tell people, that you're just driving through the park and you just get one spot, go to where I take my annual photograph. Because you get out of the car, you walk like 3.5 minutes, and you have like the splendor of the park available from that one vantage point. So I wonder if that's why they gave it to him. I think about this every year. When I heard his name, I already knew the place, and I was like, whoa, Olmsted. And that's always been on my mind, that that's why they gave him that spot. Last thing. Study number 6. Please look up. Number 6 says, how do cities interact with their environment in terms of water, soil, and air? Some of this is simple and you've already seen it, but some of this is new. How many of you have drawn this since you recognize something new on the board? I'll give you 3 minutes to draw. Go.
Are we gonna have time to see, or are we gonna eat stuff?
Maybe. Hurry up.
I am.
Hayden, not cool, bro.
My dog and John commentary.
Actually,
Yeah.
that's so cool. We took that easy.
My dad.
It's good.
Savage.
So weird.
John Palmer.
You like him?
Oh yeah.
Probably.
2 minutes. Hurry up.
loves him. He was interviewing my dad.
The bars have to be perfect.
Does he
or
do
just,
like John
make bars?
commentary?
Yes. What, Miller?
Oh. Never mind.
You see a picture of him with my dog?
No.
Yes, you do.
No. Miller, I didn't hear your question.
No, Diego got me. Diego got me.
Okay. This is your last few seconds. Okay. The water stuff you already know. I need to go quickly so that you have time to see the Unit 8. You already understand that cities prevent the recharge of groundwater, whereas the natural landscape purifies water and recharges groundwater. Cities produce polluted runoff and a dry aquifer, but natural landscape has cleaner water and that soaks into the ground for groundwater. You also know from Unit 4 that natural landscape generates soil, but cities of course have no soil functionality. Here's something that you haven't seen before. In Unit 8 we've talked about air quality, but here I need to add something that the College Board has asked at least twice, once as a free response question. There's this thing that happens in cities where they are hotter than their surroundings. See how the temperature is higher over the city? It's called the urban heat island effect, like an island of heat. You know, if you've ever been in a forest, those have low temperatures. Forests tend to be cool, shady, breezy. There's a lot of plants breathing out water, so they're evaporatively cooling. This is the reason that you want to put plants on your roof for your solar homes, evaporative cooling. But cities don't get to do any of that for a bunch of reasons that you need to know. I've seen the College Board ask you that exact question. So cities have less airflow, less wind, less air movement. Cities have less shade. You know, if you're in the middle of the street, the sun comes straight between the buildings and you're cooked. Cities have less shade. They also have no evaporative cooling. Since they don't absorb water, they don't have evaporative water to cool off. Cities produce their own heat. All the electricity and all the gasoline and all the natural gas that goes into your city, that becomes heat. I mean, think about it. Your car gives off a whole bunch of heat. Your lights give off a bunch of heat. Your house gives off, so they produce their own heat. Of course, cities have a lot of thermal mass. I mean, concrete, asphalt, metal, pretty much everything you build your city of stays hot. Like if you go to the forest right after sunset, it's chilly. Some of you might know that in the desert, snakes leave the vegetation and come out on the street to warm up at night. So right after sunset, you run over snakes. Because of course, asphalt has thermal mass, it stays hot from the daytime. And plants are shiny. My students are kind of shocked to hear this because maybe you've never noticed, but leaves are coated in wax, which is reflective, like a mirror finish. So vegetation is inherently reflective. Plants don't warm up too much. They tend to stay pretty cool, but cities are not reflective. Asphalt, concrete, rusted metal, all of these are non-reflective. So cities are much hotter, and here's why that matters. Heat causes heat stroke, high blood pressure, which can lead to heart attacks and stroke. And of course, smog is faster to form in air that is hotter. And so you would be healthier leaving the city than living in the city, especially if you have high blood pressure like my mom, or you have like a weak heart like my father-in-law, or you have a history of stroke like my stepfather-in-law. Yeah.
So living in a city makes you more likely to have a heart attack?
Yeah, to die from heat-related death. Again, in the cities of the future, this doesn't happen. In Santa Barbara, we have so much vegetation and open space that we get to avoid some of that. But if you go to a big city center, an old school traditional city, this can be really hot. London, which is one of the oldest cities, keeps having the deadliest heat stroke year after year. So 2018 beat the record of 2017, which beat the record of 2016, which beat the record of 2015, which was the record setter. Could you please stop streaming on the...
How
And you can show me your John Palmentary dog photo. Your bottle. Is it empty?
Yeah.
Would you put it in this bottom box here? I need everybody to hear.
Bottom right. Bottom right.
I need everybody to listen to something, please.
Get on there. Get on there.
Listen carefully. You're all going to ask me later. I don't want to do it twice.
It doesn't work.
The curve